So good afternoon, thank you for inviting me. Thanks to the organizers of this meeting. It's very interesting for me to learn so many new things. So I'm going to speak about my specialty in many ways. That's Jewish immigration to Uruguay. As we all know, Jewish immigration to Uruguay was part of the great migratory movements originating in Europe in the end of the 19th century, although it later developed specificities of its own. Depending on changes in the US immigration policies and in those of some South American countries, the inflow of Jewish immigrants into the Rio de la Plata area was highly variable, the largest quantities arriving between... No, I don't want to show them now. Okay. Sorry. Okay. The largest quantities arriving between 1905 and 1914 and during the 1920s. Often Montevideo was a temporary stop on the way to Buenos Aires or a place to take shelter from the more restrictive Argentine migratory regulations. Transculturation is a process through which elements of a different or foreign culture are introduced into the ways of life of a specific group inside society. As with other ethnic groups arriving on the eve of Uruguayan's modernization, Jewish immigrants found themselves in a situation of forced transculturation, coming from villages and small towns of pre-industrial European societies subject to authoritarian regimes. They found themselves in urban areas that were undergoing rapid growth amidst powerful movements of political reform. In Uruguay, as in some of the other Latin American countries, they were quickly incorporated into processes of industrial expansion that absorbed large numbers of unqualified workers. Italians and Spaniards, the largest immigrant groups already in Uruguay, were pushed to the Americas by poverty and lack of opportunities. As for the Jews, emigration was also motivated by persecution, first under Tsarist Russia and Poland, and later on in Germany and its sphere of influence as a result of the rise of Nazism. For centuries, direct and indirect occupational and educational restrictions had relegated Jews to limited areas of social, economic, and cultural activities. Jewish communities were poor and extremely vulnerable to socio-economic and political change. Thus, while incoming Spanish and Italian groups could be simply qualified as immigrants, the Jews were both immigrants and refugees. The Jews' experience was closer to that of the Gypsies and of Armenians, whose histories were also marked by discrimination and persecution. Against this backdrop, they faced the classic dilemma of diasporic Jewish communities, preserving their distinctive identity and at the same time successfully integrating into their host societies. There is not complete information regarding the demographics of Uruguay's Jewish community during the first decades of the 20th century. Since the country was a secular state that supported freedom of belief in all its varieties, statistics did not include a category for religion. The earliest reference to Jewish immigration is from 1898, when the very first Jews would have come from nearby Argentina and not from overseas. Rosa Reicher quotes a report from 1910 listing, quote, 16 families from Russia, 2 from Alsace, 8 from Greece, and 1 from Romania, as well as more than 40 single adults from Russia and France, and 25 school-aged children, totaling 150 people in the country. End of quote. By 1917, 1918, there are some estimations. There were 1,700 Jews in Uruguay. About 88% of the Jewish immigrants were Ashkenazi Jews, most of them from Eastern Europe, while other 12% were Sephardic Jews, mostly from Turkey and the Arab countries, which until the First World War were part of the Ottoman Empire, Ashkenazi Eastern European patterns of organization that were decisive in shaping the internal structure of the Uruguayan Jewish community. In 1952, the largest Jewish association in the country included about half of the estimated 8,000 Ashkenazi families living in Montevideo, and similar Ashkenazi associations existed in Salto and Paysandú. According to Reicher, this data, by the late 1950s, there were about 50,000 Jews in Uruguay, a figure that was bound to decrease significantly in the following years. Okay, now we have 12,000 Jews. While democracy usually creates favorable conditions for the integration of minorities, authoritarian involutions have the opposite effect. In Uruguay, the process of political democratization that opened the country to immigration operated as mechanisms of integration and acculturation for the immigrants. The first half of the 1930s, however, the implementation of restrictive immigration policies would disrupt the dynamics of integration and elicit isolationist attitudes among the Jews. The pressure of the Uruguayan society to include, however, was a positive force for social and civic integration. Civil society was being shaped by a progressive state within the context of the consolidation of a Uruguayan national identity that was grounded on democratic politics and social modernization. On the other hand, the arrival of immigrants at a time of decisive changes in the history of the country highlighted, quote, the permeability of the native population, which made easy the synthesis of transfer and reception that is typically found in immigrant societies. End of quote. These conditions allow the Jews to participate fully in the process of civic integration that were redefining the nation, and at the same time to be able to preserve key elements of their ethnic and religious identity in their private lives. In Europe, the Jewish immigrants have been exposed to revolutionary ideals. Many of them have been active in Jewish politics and labor unions. As a result, their involvement in Uruguayan life contributed to the same social trends, egalitarian ideologies and religious and ideological pluralism. While this public role was consistent with their need to survive as a minority within the broader society, it was the preservation of a private life focused on their Jewish identity that allowed them to define their individual and collective self-image. In this respect, the autonomy of private life worked against the homogenizing side of the process of democratization, turning into a factor that helped preserve the diversity within the state's project of inclusive modernization. The proportions with which the different contingents of Jewish immigrants initially formed the Uruguayan Jewish community were unequal. Most researchers agreed to a majority of Ashkenazim with 70%, 15% would be immigrants from Western Europe, 12% would be Sephardim, and 3% and Hungarian Jews. If this is the case, the influence of the Ashkenazi way of life in the old Eastern Europe would have been decisive in the internal organizational structure of the Jewish community in Uruguay. A study by J. Lechinsky concludes that the common features existing in the internal organization of Jewish communities in Latin America are A. The resolution of burial matters. B. The organization of religious services. C. The founding of charitable institutions. D. Credit and financial institutions. E. The organization of education. F. Large community institutions. This process is a special trait of Jewish communities throughout the world. And even if they move as individuals in their free decision to live, they carry communal values that, as soon as can be put into practice, give birth to a particular community organization. The Ashkenazi quantitative predominance contributed to bring many of its distinctive features to the entire Uruguayan Jewish community. Among them, the Kahal system or the Keylog system. That was a model of the Keilah in Europe in the 19th century, under which they were grouped. Not only Ashkenazi, but Sephardim and Western European immigrants as well. Eastern Europe was transplanted with a remarkable sense of community self-government, an sense of organization that at the beginning created associations according to countries, regions, or cities of origin. D. Lazar explains that, quote, separate community associations based on the Landmannschaft principle, territoriality, became the basis for community affiliation of immigrants in Latin America. End of quote. This meant in Uruguay 4 distinctive Keylot and various Jewish immigrant associations. For example, those for Poles, those for Lithuanians, those for Latvians, and those for Hungarians. The first Jewish institution founded in Uruguay was the Jewish Union Ezra in 1909, whose aims were to help the needy to get them work or occupation, to improve their educational level through lectures and appropriate readings, to create a library and a night school for adults, and to help them economically with loans. In these objectives, a briefing of all organizational projects can be seen, and this would develop much later in time. The Jewish cemetery, the religious services, the savings and credit cooperatives, the school network for children, the night education net for adults, and all sorts of charities. The complex construction of a Jewish self-definition implied the establishment and maintenance of some boundaries between the Jews as a minority and the rest of the Uruguayan society, and also, as we have seen, inside the Jewish minority itself. I will illustrate this point with a scheme that identifies 4 levels of social adscription. Okay, so the first level of adscription is given by the person's self-identification as a Jew within the larger non-Jewish Uruguayan society. The second level is related to the different rituals, liturgies, languages, and traditions that were responsible for the formation of 4 distinctive Keylot sub-communities: the Ashkenazim, the Sephardim, the German and Austrian Jews, and the Hungarians. Linguistic and ceremonial particularities led to further differentiation among the Sephardim, with the Ladino and the Arabic-speaking groups keeping their own liturgies in their different temples. The third level of adscription corresponds to Landsman societies or Landsmannschaften, where the affiliations were based on a common origin from particular towns, districts, and countries. Some examples were the Yiddish-Lithuanian-Latvian Association, the Yiddish-Polish Federation, and the Residents of Vilna Society. On top of this, the 4th level of adscription was defined by the kind of political and ideological participation. Among the Uruguayan Jewish immigrants, there were many who identified themselves as communists, others as Bundists, others as Zionist socialists, and others as anarchists. Most of these groups founded their own educational institutions, and some of them ran credit unions and other mutual benefit programs. The communists, Bundists, and Zionist socialists established, each of them, elementary schools that supplemented the education received by the Uruguayan public schools, introducing the children to their own particular interpretations of Jewish history, language, and tradition, which were very, very different. This organizational pattern shows that a substantial part of the Jewish community went along with the evolution of the ideological trends that would prevail among the Uruguayan artisans and workers until the early 40s. In a general way, it shows that the social integration of Uruguayan Jews was a complex structuring process that shaped the relationship between the Jews as a minority and the larger society, and at the same time established institutional frameworks intended for the preservation of alternative ideological identifications within the Jewish community itself, which means a confrontation between the integration process and the need to have an internal freedom of choice inside the community, which is, I think, is a distinctive character of Judaism all over the world, to be able to choose among different alternatives inside the minority, and at the same time confronting the inclusion into a new host society. According to Bataille, the concept of value is key to understanding the most intimate aspects of the human mind, because values are models of desirability and as such provide the basis for norms. End of quote. To understand the private life of Jewish immigrants in Uruguay, then it's important to identify the core values that have remained relatively stable through their diverse and lengthy diaspora. Throughout the 19th century, the Ashkenazic Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe had experienced a growing westernization of their ways of life. This trend emerged from the liberal cosmopolitan aspect of lay, rationalistic Judaism, which had been influenced by the philosophy of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution's call for equal rights for all citizens, and the emancipation of the Jews in Western European states. But at the same time, by the end of the 19th century, the Ashkenazi Jews faced a conservative nationalistic backlash in the form of a new, more sophisticated form of state-sanctioned or semi-official anti-Semitism. In Tsarist Russia and also in Poland, under the influence of the Catholic Church, there were massive attacks against Jewish populations, supported by the new urban sectors that viewed Jewish integration as a source of economic competition. The rapid changes in community life, the rising tide of anti-Semitism, and the lack of economic opportunities increased the massive emigrations of Jews from Central and Eastern Europe to the Americas in the late 19th century and early 20th century. That being said, it is important to realize that one main consequence of the previous experience of westernization was the immigrants' disposition and will to embrace and participate in the process of modernization. This can be seen in the distribution of roles within the typical Ashkenazi immigrant family, which, compared to the patriarchal family model that prevailed in the Uruguayan society, was characterized by greater gender equality and a more democratic system of decision-making. This specificity hinged on a system of values that supported egalitarianism between genders and generations, and encouraged upward mobility through free public education, self-initiative, and social integration through access to new occupations. In contrast, the Sephardic Jews had been influenced by the hierarchical and authoritarian quality of the social, political, and cultural structures of the Ottoman Empire. Sephardim arrived in Uruguay steeped in an observant conservative religious tradition that gives husbands complete authority over wives and children, despite the fact that the women carried most of the responsibility for the welfare of the family. This meant an important difference in regard to the Ashkenazic Jews. In addition, the Sephardic Jewish immigrants had also been exposed to discrimination, and their relationship with their external environment had been sometimes difficult, although their solid family structure had provided a basis that helped preserve their Jewish identity. From the perspective of symbolic interactionism, identity construction is a dynamic and active process of everyday interactions which result in the individual's internalization of attitudinal and behavioral systems. In this process, social labels such as immigrant and such as Jew can play a very important role. In Uruguay at that time, the term immigrant operated in a domain of moderate prejudice within a meaning of generalized disdain towards gringos, foreigners. In general, in Spanish, the term Jew has a much stronger connotation of contempt and rejection, yes, because it is deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. I finished in Castilian. Okay. As a way of conclusion, in Uruguay, the arrival of Jewish immigrants produced an individual and collective identity that balanced integration and autonomy under a double process of organization that defined the substance of the relationships between Jews and non-Jews, and while at the same time shaping the institutional network for Jewish life as a minority. The integration of Jewish immigrants into the Uruguayan society did not take the form of an automatic dissolution into a social and cultural melting pot, since we are against the theory of the melting pot. Instead, the Jews recreated their own identity on the basis of the autonomy that they were able to exercise in their private sphere, within the minority, within the community. In this process, they managed to preserve a distinctive place of their own as a minority within the wider national society. Thank you very much.